you, Kim. I'm Robert Hampson. I'm the chair of the Joseph Conrad Society UK. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 47th Annual International Conference of the Joseph Conrad Society UK. As you know, we had intended to have this year's conference in Pescara, and I'd like to thank Tanya Zuli for all the work she did setting that up and organising that. So I'm pleased to see a mixture of familiar faces and also of new names, a mixture of established Conradians, early career researchers, and also postgraduates. I estimate we have papers from some 14 different countries, although appropriately enough, it's quite difficult sometimes to work out what France and Spain through to Georgia, India, Israel, Japan, and Taiwan. So I hope you all have a very good conference. I hope my connection remains.
Okay, so without further ado then, we'll start our first panel session, which I'm going to be chairing. What I would suggest is there's a chat function at the bottom of the screen. And if you have a question for the speakers, please write your question and address the speaker. So put the name of the speaker in the chat function. And at the end of the panel, we'll have 15 minutes left, or maybe a little bit more, for questions. If you could all stick to your 15 minutes maximum, any more than that, then the hands of God may come down and press mute, and you might be dragged off the stage. So we'd really appreciate that. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker for this first panel, which is Joanna Scollock. And Joanna Scollock is an associate professor at the University of Poland. And together with Władysław Najda, she said to Polski, oh, Joanna, you're really challenging me here. Polski zlebesz Józefa Konrada Korzeniewskiego. Sorry, Joseph Conrad Korzeniewski's Polish background. She's also published a book, The Ideal of Fidelity in Conrad's Works, and several articles on Conrad. Her research focuses on the reception of Conrad, on Conrad's ethics, and on the cultural significance of the Polish Eastern borderlands. She's also the secretary of the Joseph Conrad Society of Poland. So, Joanna, would you like to share your slides, and please take it away? Can everybody mute themselves? Peter Villiers?
Yeah, I am on mute.
I'll mute you, don't worry. Joanna, are you there? Joanna? Joanna? Ah, you're on mute. Okay, you need to unmute yourself. Okay.
Thanks a lot. I just cannot unmute myself, so thanks a lot.
Oh.
Okay, I will just share.
Okay.
Okay, I will start just in a while. Okay. One of my Conradian friends, in an email sent to me at the beginning of the pandemic, wrote, it's a very Conradian situation, isn't it? A borderline one. After a few months, I realized that in fact, it's not just a Conradian situation, but a Conradian year. Whatever happens this year is as exceptional and unexpected as Marlowe noted in Lord Jim, thinking about Jim Spatna's accident. It's always the unexpected that happens. All our plans and projects have been destroyed one by one. Our familiar and friendly world disappeared. We are facing the hostile, unknown, unpredicted, and unexpected reality. Moreover, we have no place to escape, like Razumov, the main protagonist of Under Western Eyes, who only wanted to retire, simply to retire, and who received no explanation or consolation. Instead, he heard Councillor Mikulin's laconic words, "Where to?" We realize, like him, that there is no such a place on earth where we can find a refuge. The here and now of the pandemic is overwhelming, but we have to cope with that and try to live on. We experience the revaluation of everything. The material world gives way to the spiritual one, to the Conradian world of values, if only we are able to notice it. We feel more lonely than before. We feel lost and forgotten. We resemble Don Martin Decoud, the plump dandy journalist of Conrad's Nostromo. All of Decoud's reserves of worldly irony and skepticism are useless once he is marooned on a desert island. Despairing, he fills his pockets with silver bars, and, Conrad writes, is swallowed up by the immense indifference of things. Comments Stuart Jeffries in The Spectator's review. For loneliness is a dangerous phenomenon. I quote, "One definition of loneliness is solitude continued further than intended. What started as self-liberation becomes a life sentence, and for some it happened during the pandemic lockdown." Terry Eagleton writes that the greatest difference of all is that solitude has rarely killed anyone, whereas loneliness can drive you to the grave. As the coronavirus rampages, some of us might now face a choice between physical infection and mental breakdown. And who better than Conrad tells the story about human loneliness? Jim's, Mrs. Gould's, Nostromo's, Orwell's stories. We live as we dream, alone. Social media become more real than before, and we tend to meet there not to show off our individuality and exceptionality, but to seek community, togetherness, human understanding, and comfort. For some, it is also a trial time when people become more or less human, heroes or cowards. Moreover, they learn these new things about themselves too. Similarly to young Marlowe on board the Judea or Jim on board the Butler. Those who all their lives remained unnoticed suddenly find out that they are serving on the front line of the coronavirus. Doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, and many others. And they find in themselves so much strength and power because they feel they must do it, do or die. And all of us, no matter where we are asking ourselves time's question, how to live. During the coronavirus, the lockdown, we all experience Conradian world, a small space where several people are gathered, the problems people have to face, and the hostile environment around. Just like on board a ship in Conrad's works, sometimes literally on board when thinking about people on cruise ships, and sometimes in our flats, homes, hotel rooms, which become such ships for quite a long time. Conrad's Shadow Line is a very pandemic novel, for it not only presents viral contagion on board a ship with all its consequences, namely captain's emotions concerning lack of the needed medicine and helplessness, despair and yearning, but also gives hope to the reader, describing the most important factors for the crew survival, such as human solidarity, understanding, and commitment. Describing what is happening now, what we are facing day by day, we can refer to Conrad. Details may vary, but the essence of a matter is the same. Can I continue? Hello? Am I heard?
Yeah, it's okay, Joanna. I think somebody took their mute off. It's fine. Carry on.
Okay, so can I continue? Okay. It is not the first time when we turn to Conrad while facing a difficult or a borderline situation. During the Second World War, Conrad became the favorite author of young Polish conspirators actively engaged in fighting the Nazi regime, who identified themselves with Conrad's regime and live according to the ethics of honor. Hannah Arendt, discussing the banality of evil and pointing to the colonial atrocities in Africa as the origin of the Germans, Nazism, and the crimes leading to European Holocaust, referred to Conrad's prophetic heart of darkness, as well as Coppola presenting Vietnam horror in his Apocalypse Now. We also turn to Conrad's political essays Secret Agent or Under Western Eyes, while trying to describe and to explain the mechanism of modern terrorism or Russian policy towards the West, just to mention Skripal, Litvinenko, or Navalny poisoning. Conrad's works appear in the public space and function as a kind of a reference point for current political events. As Will Self commented in April 2019, the current efforts by a demagogic, if not despotic, Russian regime to destabilize British politics would have been at once no surprise and complete one for Conrad, whose essay Autocracy and War set out his political thinking in the period when he was writing The Secret Agent. Thus, Conrad's works concerning Russia, the most terrifying reflection is that the oppressors and the oppressed are all Russian, and the world is brought once more face to face with the truth, of saying that the tiger cannot change his stripes, not the leopard his spots. These words still resonate with us. As Julie Beth Napoleon puts it, works like ships leave behind them a wake, a vibration on the surface of water, and we respond to them. We became part of the event. We experience the never neutral act of resounding. The same happens when reading other Conrad's works dealing with the most important dilemmas of human life. Resonance became the privileged metaphor for this movement because there is something of that is not a metaphor at all, but a fact. Conrad's phrases resonate, they survive, but have been transformed by the reader. What was written earlier resonates at present. The presents resound into and against the past, and the phrases open up space for touching the other. The resonance forms a relation between the text, the reader, and the real world. We have the feeling that what Conrad was writing about in the past exists today, as if he wrote about our experience, our emotions and quandaries, that he understood what we are going through now. His words resonate with us. This phenomenon is connected with Conrad's unique insight, sensitivity, and vision, which are connected with the combination of a few elements, his contemporariness and, in a very general meaning, life experience. Conrad is perceived as a prophetic writer by successive contemporaries. He becomes our contemporary, as Josiane Pakuige wrote in her article on Under Western Eyes, for many generations. Conrad is our temporary in Agamben's understanding. Those who have tried to think about contemporariness have been able to do so only by splitting it up into several times, by introducing into time an essential dishomogeneity. Those who say my time actually divide time. The contemporary who has broken the vertebra of his time, or at any rate who has perceived in it a fault line or a breaking point, then he also makes of this fracture a meeting place or an encounter between times and generation. It is the one who, dividing and interpolating time, is capable of transforming it and putting it in relations with other times. Not only Conrad's phrases, but also his life experience hidden in them do resonate with us. Conrad was living in between the past and the present in two dimensions. The real one among flesh and blood people, and the spectral one haunted by ghosts and shadows from his and his fatherland's past. Childhood trauma is a consequence of living under the oppressive shadow of the great Russian Empire in the partitioned Poland, namely painful experience of his family exile and national mourning. And the overwhelming feeling of loneliness, fear and uncertainty accompanying him all his life. Conrad is our contemporary, for he was personally traumatized as we are at present. Now we are living under the oppressive shadow of the epidemic, and this experience has stamped us for the rest of our lives, though we still haven't realized that. We hope that everything will be as it was, but it wouldn't. To be traumatized, as Kathy Karup has explained, is to be possessed by an image or event located in the past. Conrad, transposing his childhood trauma into his stories, not only broke the vertebra of his time, referring to the past, but also resonating with the present. Moreover, Conrad had a unique chance to be the other, a bloody foreigner, as he called himself in a letter to Graham. Our guest, as Virginia Woolf called him, a man without language or country, according to Robert Lind, and one of us, a white European, a seaman at the same time. He could understood both sides, us and them. In connection with his previous life experience, it resulted in Conrad's unique sensitivity toward those in need, the weak, the poor, and the forgotten, toward their dignity. Additionally, Conrad lived through at least two great historical events, or using Nassim Taleb's terminology, two black swans. Black swans are large-scale, unpredictable, and irregular events of massive consequence, which are often inappropriately rationalized after the fact with the benefit of hindsight, and most of history comes from black swan events. Conrad experienced the consequences of the partitions of Poland and survived the First World War. That is why Conrad writes, "It is always the unexpected that happens," and that is why black swans quite frequently visit his works. And Conrad shows what to do in order to survive hard times, or following Taleb's theory, he teaches us how to become anti-fragile. Although Taleb himself is irritated whenever the coronavirus pandemic is referred to as a black swan, according to him it was wholly predictable. In my opinion, it is for most of us a true black swan. We were neither prepared for it nor expected it. Conrad's prose in a time of black swan is invaluable, both now during the pandemic and then during the war or terrorist attacks. It is needed. As Taleb said, anti-fragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same. The anti-fragile gets better. This property is behind everything that has changed with time: evolution, culture, ideas, revolution, political systems. Anti-fragile loves randomness and uncertainty, which also means crucially a love of errors, a certain class of errors. Anti-fragility has a singular property of allowing us to deal with the unknown, to do things without understanding them, and do them well. It's better to learn through errors than to avoid them at all costs. And Conrad teaches us that young Marlowe in youth on his way to Bangkok gains anti-fragility while repeating and following do or die principle. In Heart of Darkness, on his journey up the Congo River, Marlowe becomes more anti-fragile. Jean, very fragile at the very beginning of the novel, tries to be prepared for unpredictable, makes mistakes, and learns how to follow Pindar's formula: be what you know you are, and becomes anti-fragile. The French lieutenant is unwavering. Like a rock, he does not change with time. He's not subject to volatility. He is robust. While Brearley, one of the most successful seamen in the Pacific, is fragile and not able to admit. When he realizes his own fragility, he passes the ultimate judgment on himself. The same happens to Martin Decoux or Nostromo. So anti-fragile are Jim and Marlowe in youth. When reading Conrad in the time of pandemic, we realize that the most important in human solidarity and understanding is the only escape from the trap of despair and hopelessness. Conrad's words, written in his preface to The Nigger of the Narcissus about the artist's appeal to the subtle but invincible conviction of solidarity that knits together the loneliness on innumerable hearts, to the solidarity in dream, in joy, in sorrow, reverberate in our minds and resonate with us. Suddenly, we realize that they are not elevated and turgid, but comforting and hopeful. The same happens with Conrad's protagonists. We notice them around us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I think you did outstandingly for the first paper, so that's very much appreciated. Always difficult to be the first, especially with a bit of interference, I think, kind of coming in. So thank you very much. If you stop showing your screen, yep, perfect. And Katsuwa Tanaka, I'm unmuting you.
Yep.
Great, you're there. Perfect. Do you want to share your screen with us now?
Yeah. Could you wait a while? Okay.
Okay, so I just introduced you. So our second paper comes from Tanaka Katsuwa, who received his undergraduate degree at Osaka City University in Japan in 2006. He then received his MA degree and doctorate at Osaka University. He worked as a junior associate professor at Bukio University, Kyoto in Japan, from April 2015 to March 2020. He's been teaching English as an associate professor at the University of Kumamoto Prefecture since April. And he's been interested in the poetics of Joseph Conrad's works that allow him to parody his contemporary discourse or even to self-parody his works. So I'll hand over to you now. I'll send you a message when you've got 5 minutes left.
Sorry, so might I possibly start my presentation?
Yes, start your presentation.
Okay, sorry. My line is a little bit busy, so I am afraid it is a little difficult for you to catch up what I say. Maybe so I'd like to update my files at Google Drive later. Okay, so I'd like to start my presentation. And so introduction is like this. As everyone knows, the present situation about COVID-19 cannot be described but as a worldwide pandemic. More than 22 million people are infected with the coronavirus. The scale of this pandemic is so huge that it is beyond our cognition. Accordingly, in order to grasp the scale of the infection, we inevitably use a metaphor. What is a metaphor? Here, now move on to the next page. Okay. In order to express the huge number of the infected people, the scale of the present pandemic is often compared with war. For example, President Trump compared the influence of coronavirus with Japan's attack on the Pearl Harbor, and this allows severe criticism. And in addition, the American magazine Time once alarmed that the comparison with COVID-19 and war is ethically dangerous. That kind of comparison simplifies the current situation too much, and people tend to ignore risks and problems that doctors and nurses actually are faced with. Okay. Considering both the current situation and our metaphorical reference to war, fans of Joseph Conrad cannot help remembering the shadow line. Needless to say, this novel represents an anonymous narrator who by chance gains captaincy. He manages to sail a ship from Bangkok to Singapore despite the dead calm and malaria. Today, in my humble presentation, I'd like to consider how and why this shadow line is universal. And so I'd like to focus on the following 3 points. Firstly, representation of the narrator's sailing ship. Secondly, the crew described as an anonymous group. Thirdly, the novel's representation of the captain narrator's maturation. As a result, Conrad manages to carry out a tour de force. He represents and even contains the social impact of World War I through a maritime fiction, although apparently they are unrelated. And so as for the representation of the narrator's ship, we have to remember that a sailing ship is an enclosed society. Needless to say, in order to sail a ship, sailors have to cooperate. Nevertheless, however hard they work together, sailing ships cannot move without winds. Accordingly, Dr. Nadash Lotu puts it, the narrator's ship embodies a situation of collective survival. A point to note here is what words the novel used to express a situation. Here, look at the quotation. When the narrator faces a difficulty in the sailing, the narrator refers to his ship as a planet. This word implies that the sailing ship cannot be freely handled in accordance with the captain's will. In addition, its crew suffer from malaria and cannot work enough. Consequently, the narrator is represented as a person who has to admit his inability to deal with the crisis. The narrator's inability like this echoes Conrad's contemporary people's frustration about the Great War. Also, this is resonant with everyone who faces the present coronavirus pandemic and its problems of collective survival. Let me go to the next slide. However, the novel does not only write about the narrator's inability or resignation. When the narrator talks to the helmsman, the narrator describes the wheel as a symbol of mankind's claim to the direction of its own fate. As the connotation of the word claim indicates, the narrator cannot completely be convinced of the rightness of his intention. Nonetheless, at any rate, he does not surrender to the circumstances. This scene exemplifies a Conradian struggle that a person strives to retain his or her dignity in the face of the uncontrollable conditions. This is also a universal appeal of Conrad's works. Now let me focus on the second point, the representation of the crew in the narrator's ship. Before considering this point, we should remember to whom this novel is dedicated. It is written for not only Conrad's son Boris, but also the youth like him. As is well known among Conradians, Boris joined the Great War and later suffered from PTSD. As critics point out, this dedication alludes to Conrad's intention, that he took into consideration the young soldiers at the war. However, as my first point suggests, the novel apparently has no scenes echoing the Great War directly. Yet, when we pay attention to the dedication and its reference to the youth, it is appropriate to think that Conrad's care about the young generation as a whole. Here, it is useful to look at the scene in which the narrator confesses the lack of medicine to the crew. This scene has invited critics to consider why the narrator feels too guilty about the lack, which is caused not by him, but by the previous captain. In fact, no shipmates criticize him, and their reaction even shows their respect to the narrator captain. However, I believe another point should also be considered. When the crew listen to and accept the narrator captain's words, they are consistently depicted as a collected and silent group. At the same time, as Dr. Alan H. Simmons puts it, few of the crew are identified. This lack of the crew's identities is comparable to Conrad's other maritime fictions, for example, The Nigger of the Narcissus or Typhoon. In consequence, this scene impresses on the reader the crew's silent obedience and anonymity. And when we consider the anonymity and silence of the crew, a point to note is characteristics of early 20th century literature. According to Dr. Araki Eiko, the literature in that period is unable to represent shock of numbers. More correctly, that shock is triggered by various kinds of huge numbers in statistics and in the modern society. In a word, In that period, authors and critics were overwhelmed by the industrial society that inevitably emphasizes mass production and statistics. Writers, therefore, had to admit difficulties in representing personal values in the style of realism. Furthermore, this shock became more intensified by mass living and mass death in the World War I. Mass living and mass death both deal with a huge number of anonymous people. Consequently, modernist writers are faced with complete difficulty in representing them. As for the relationship between the shock, mass living, and mass death, Dr. Araki quotes T.S. Eliot's poem, Triumphal March. As the below quotation shows, Eliot is particular about the concrete huge numbers, as if he were haunted by those particularities. These particularities, contradictorily, hide flesh and blood people behind statistics, as if those people did not have their voices. In a word, the representation of the anonymous silent crew is resonant with both modernist characteristics and the Great War. However, the novel does not unconditionally emphasize anonymity of the crew or the narrator. Now let me consider the third point, the captain narrator's maturity. At any rate, he and his shipmates managed to sail to Singapore. As this quotation shows, he confesses to Captain Giles, "I am no longer a youngster." This scene ostensibly depicts the narrator's growth. He has certainly demonstrated his effectiveness by handling the ship. However, there are 2 points to consider. Firstly, the route of his sailing serves to cast doubt his maturity. As critics argue, the narrator eventually only returned to Singapore. That is to say, the starting point. The circular route and narrative structure function to contain his maturity and maturation. This containment is reinforced by the final line of the quotation. He has to go back to the ship and continue to sail. In other words, he is only in the middle of his voyage. Accordingly, this continuity embodies never-ending hardships that he has to face. And this implies that there is no panacea to them. More importantly, this lack of panacea and endless adversity are resonant with Conrad's contemporary situation about the war. This quotation therefore alludes to Conrad's struggle to deal with the war. However, the never-ending hardships impress the reader with the failure of Conrad's struggle. Secondly, nevertheless, we should take another point into consideration. The narrator and the crew are anonymous, but the novel does not indicate Conrad's failure to face the war or the people involved in it. This is because he certainly managed to represent an individual and his values and actions. That person is, of course, the captain narrator. Here we should remember a recent article in the New York Times. This quoted article appeared on 24th May, and in that period it was evident that we should have no choice but to face the pandemic for at least 1 or 2 years. The headline apparently emphasizes the huge number of the deaths in the US. But however, the intention of the article is completely different from ordinary ones, which deals only with the statistics. In fact, this article attempts to represent dead individuals whose concrete lives are usually hidden behind statistics. Although only 2 or 3 lines are allotted to each person, they crystallizes their life histories. In a word, this attempt was carried out in the style of a novel by Conrad more than 100 years earlier. Now let us go to the conclusion. Now I'd like to conclude my presentation. The social and cultural crisis was caused by the Great War, and it was literally a planetary scaled war. There, Countless anonymous people died, and their number was recorded by statistics. Likewise, the shadow line focuses on the anonymous crew, and they struggle to sail the ship despite their hardships. Conrad thereby alludes to and allegorically represents the disaster of the Great War. More importantly, he strives to represent an individual whose life is usually unclear in the dry statistics. The shadow line therefore exemplifies both modern and universal aspects of the world. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for sticking to time. That was perfectly timed again. So now we're moving on to our next paper, which is from James Royce Murphy, who is a retired practitioner and a GP trainer in Gloucester in England. He studied at Bristol University for his medical degree and for the diploma in medical education. He completed his master's in medical humanities at Swansea University in 2004 with a dissertation on healing narrative. He was also the ethics lead for 15 years for the University of Bristol at Gloucestershire Academy, where he organised the teaching of ethics to medical students from the university. He has a long-standing interest in Joseph Conrad and in narrative as applied to general medical practice and ethics. So James Royce Murphy, would you like to share your slides with us? You should be able to unmute yourself, but
yes,
let me know are you there?
Yeah, I think I'm here.
Perfect, we can hear you. Oh, you don't have slides, do you?
Right.
No, that's all right then.
No, can I start? I'm moving. Can I start? I can't see myself on the main screen yet.
If everybody presses speaker view, then they should be able to, if you press speaker view and everyone else presses speaker view, you should be.
I'm on speaker view, but I've got a photograph of somebody with Oscar Wilde.
Me. You don't want me.
So I'm not on yet. I'll check the video. Yes, I'm on for video and I'm off mute. Okay.
Go ahead, James.
Thank you. I'm continuing the medical theme, but I'm moving from the global to the personal. And this address is based on an article I wrote for the Yearbook of Conrad Studies published in 2014. The article concerns Joseph Conrad's illnesses and is mostly based on the 9-volume series of his letters published by Cambridge University Press, with some reference to his other works and commentaries in print about his health during his very varied life. Some details of his medical history we can be relatively confident about. Conrad suffered from pneumonia as a child, migraine, and a nervousness which was linked to a family history of epilepsy by family members and later biographers. He often missed regular schooling because of illness and was taught privately. Depressed about financial ruin in 1879, he attempted suicide with a chest gunshot wound he later passed off as a dueling scar. The true history of this is remarkably preserved in a letter from his uncle and second guardian to his former guardian. Following his well-documented malaria in the Congo in 1891, he was admitted to hospital in London and later a sanatorium in Geneva, where he was also treated for inflammation of the legs. And Conrad's visits to Champel for convalescence and recuperation and his later catalogue of symptoms have all been seen as evidence for psychological instability. And some biographers have concluded that his later symptoms were predominantly psychological in origin. And here it is important to mention, but there is not the time to go into, the work of Jocelyn Baines and Bernard Mayer, whose conclusions that the illnesses of Joseph Conrad were substantially affected by his anxieties, I would not dispute. Conrad was often under stress, working through the night to complete novels. He also had 2 more dramatic episodes of serious delirium with confused rambling in Polish, described by Jesse, his wife, when on his honeymoon in 1896, and in 1910 when he was nursed through 2 days of confusion, followed by weeks of convalescence by his family. The later episode of confusion was diagnosed as a complete nervous breakdown, but was also accompanied by complex physical symptoms. In addition, in 1904, he fell unconscious at home alone for almost 2 hours, and he describes other intriguing periods of cognitive disturbance at various times in his illnesses. Conrad clearly used his subjective experiences in his stories extensively, and a literary strength is the emotional metaphor which he so brilliantly characterizes in his work. And nor have I any objection to illness as metaphor. Susan Sontag particularly has described this so well and relevantly. Humans are a holistic blend of body, mind and spirit, however one wants to define those terms. And Conrad's life was filled with action and anxiety. However, Conrad himself was aware of hypochondriasis as a diagnosis, and in his letters considers and rejects it. And as a GP, I was also unhappy to attribute all of this to psychological illness alone, because this physical and complex illness is so clearly and repeatedly described. So from a GP's point of view, taking the history is complicated. In his letters, symptoms seem at times to have been exaggerated or played down, depending on the recipient, Conrad's intentions, and perhaps mood at the time. He certainly used illness to avoid appointments. Letters mentioning illness were mostly to agents, publishers, and close friends. However, some other remarkably frank letters to infrequent correspondence mentioning symptoms lend a note of authenticity to these accounts because of an absence of motive in those cases. Conrad struggled not only with his symptoms, but also with any understanding of his illness, questioning the diagnosis, and indeed raging in himself with the existential frustration of having to suffer it at all. This later recurrent and complex illness seems almost to have been dismissed in the literature. Work pressures and anxieties over Jesse's illnesses certainly did coincide in time with his own symptoms to his frustration, but also isolated from stress at other times and frequently frustrated appointments or work he wished to complete. As a note, his hand X-ray is published and shows only common osteoarthritis changes of age. Conrad most often used colloquial language to describe symptoms. Seediness is used in 64 of the relevant 841 letters, both in mild illness and in convalescence from serious episodes. This social and somewhat archaic word is taken to mean malaise. In 16 of the letters, he used the word shaky, that is malaise with lack of confidence, and in 40, he describes himself as laid up, immobile, but not necessarily in bed, though he did spend many days in bed when he was most ill. In 181 letters, he mentions gout, but in 143 letters, he refers to specific limb, joint, or back pain. He also reports influenza or other respiratory symptoms in 73 of the letters, often associated with joint pain. He describes facial symptoms, either inflammation or neuralgia, in 8 letters. He was probably free of illness as late as 1921 between January and April, and in 1922 for 4 months, apart from wrist pain. However, through the rest of 1923, following his American tour, and until his death in 1924, he suffered a continuous deterioration of health and loss of energy and morale while completing correspondence mainly about his collected works. These episodes of joint pain were accompanied by other symptoms not normally associated with gout. As I say, temperature, cough, cognitive disturbance, facial pain, inflammation. He describes gout in the gums, gouty eczema, gouty throat, gouty dyspepsia, and these are terms not recognized in modern medicine to have anything to do with gout, but of which Conrad seems to have been made aware by doctors. And he had several episodes that started with fever, progressed to joint pain, and then resulted in a persistent and chronic cough. And he writes of these, "The monotony of the thing is intolerable, the same odious sensations in the same order and ending in the same period of depression. But these complex symptoms do not appear in gout, which is the diagnosis normally given. And they also don't suggest to me a psychosomatic illness." Now, systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, or commonly called lupus, is one of the so-called autoimmune diseases in which the body attacks itself through the immune system. So I will use SLE here. SLE was first described a few years before Conrad's death, but effective treatment followed much later. Interestingly, Conrad probably self-medicated with aspirin and quinine, as well as the colchicine he was prescribed for the diagnosis of gout. And all of these can have a beneficial effect in SLE in the absence of modern drugs like steroids. The scarring of his cheeks in later photographs can be a result of facial inflammation in SLE. That is also seen in certain heart disease and acne rosacea of the face, but they're ruled out in my mind, partly because a doctor had documented a normal heart examination and he would have heard a murmur, I'm sure. And the winter dating of the letters referred to the facial rash rules out acne rosacea, which is a summer illness in the main. And I conclude that SLE was the most likely cause of his major illness. Making an accurate diagnosis 100 years after Conrad's death, even with the benefit of modern medicine, is difficult. As I mentioned, gout was always blamed, but there are 4 objections to the diagnosis of gout. Firstly, the big toe is only mentioned once, and this is the main joint affected by gout. Secondly, gout is not accompanied by the other symptoms Conrad describes. Thirdly, his documented treatment response is repeatedly very poor. Colchicine is still used today in gout and is normally effective very quickly. And fourthly, there is no evidence of gouty joint destruction on his hand X-ray. SLE also causes severe skin inflammation, joint pains, chest inflammation, chronic cough, heart failure, and neuropsychiatric illness. And all of these he had. He also suffered permanent hoarseness after one attack, which is a known complication of SLE of the throat, which can be severe. Now, although many letters were destroyed by him, a great many survived and continue to illuminate deeply our understanding of his life and work. And I hope in this presentation, his illnesses. Joseph Conrad himself craved an explanation of this illness. He was aware of psychosomatic illness, but he rejected it as a cause. A question: would effective treatment have changed his writing? One has to admit, struggle certainly inspires artistic work. However, I believe his writing mainly refers to conflicts of a human rather than a medical nature. And his illness was certainly more of a hindrance than a help. And to be honest, I feel for him 100 years later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, perfectly timed. We're doing very well here. Okay, we're going to move on to our final speaker of this panel, who is Subir Dhar Ray. So Subir, while I'm introducing you, do you want to get your, do you want to share your slides? I think you should be able to unmute yourself, but let me know if you can't. Yeah?
Yeah,
Good. Okay, if you put your slides up. So, Subir Dhar Ray was awarded the doctoral degree by the University of Kalyani, India, for his thesis on authority and responsibility in Joseph Conrad's major novels. He's presently an associate professor of the Department of English of Bidhan Chandra College, Kazi Nazrul University, India, and a member of the Joseph Conrad Society of America. Working on a comparative study of Conrad and Bengali modernist fiction, Ray is a contributor to some intertextual chords of Joseph Conrad's literary art, edited by Krika in 2019, and to Joseph Conrad's and Ethics, edited by Amar Akirion and Letitia Cremon, 2021, both included in the series Conrad, Eastern and Western Perspectives. Ray's recent publications include a critical study on translation of Bengali short stories in Disability in Translation, The Indian Experience, edited by Sumshwar Sati and GJV Prasad, published by Routledge, London. He's also presented his paper at the 6th International Joseph Conrad Conference in Lublin, Poland in 2016. Is that the 6th or the 46th, 36th? Anyway, I'm going to hand you over to Subir Dhar Ray. Thank you very much.
I wish to begin by congratulating the Center for Joseph Conrad Studies of St. Mary's University for organizing this virtual conference, when, in Marlowe's phrase in Lord Jim, the community of mankind is experiencing instability and insecurity of the supposedly actual world in face of an unexpected terror. Conrad's later contemporary, India's most famous hunter of man-eaters and an Anglo-Indian author, Jim Corbett, in The Man-Eating Leopard of Rudraprayag, unsettles the order of signification in relation to the uncanny in this manner. I quote, "The word terror is so generally and universally used in connection with everyday trivial matters that it fails to convey, when intended to do so, its real meaning. The object of terror here, the leopard, is partly actual and partly a spectre, frequently escaping human capacity to comprehend and thereby intensifying a haunting feeling. With their spectral effects, Conrad's secrets too often oscillate between the actual and the virtual, and his tales are of particular interest in developing a critique of the fearful symmetry of our time. Set on the imperial margin, Joseph Conrad's literary art exhibits, to quote two phrases from An Outpost of Progress, the negation of the habitual and the affirmation of the unusual. The effect of the tropic, particularly on European traders, colonizers, in his Asian and African tales, is generally posited as unsafe for their psychosomatic stability. But Conrad's preoccupation in his life and fiction with the themes of deracination and cultural mixing relates the issues of death and sickness in the colony to deeper ethical questions relating the imperial politics of othering, as well as the human survival. In this connection, Conrad brings flashes of insight to his fictional journey into the terrains of the unknown, the potential and the repressed in the Eastern colonies. They undercut a naturalized Eurocentric worldview in relation to what is obliquely mentioned in An Outpost of Progress as, I quote, "the evil spirit that rules the land under the equator," and involves a series of voices or speech acts to relate individual monarchs and objects through varying spaces between them across the simple binary of the self and the other. For instance, extremely differentiated nature of cultural signifiers mark the guilt-ridden Arthur's awe and trust in his listener and friend, the white man, in Conrad's early tale, Malaya tale, The Lagoon. Now, in a series of modernist works from the southern colonies, above and under the equator, the Conradian evil spirit may be seen to be unleashed to find new colors and sonorities. This paper proposes to study the narrative journey from Joseph Conrad's treatment of the dead and sick, as well as and the other in two Eastern states, An Outpost of Progress and The Lagoon, to two tales on Bengali countryside written by the post-Tagore major Bengali modernist author Manik Bandopadhyay, Burnt Turmeric and The Right to Suicide. The modernists turn in these works with their pairing of the known and the unknowable deserve post-structuralist analysis that acknowledges the relativity of what we can be sure of. The cosmopolitan modernity of Bengali fiction written in the interverse and post-Second World War period was formed amidst the violent destruction of humanity under the late neo-colonial rule by reappropriating contemporary experiments in European art and philosophy to exhibit a very intriguing sense of source and provinciality. For example, first published in 1923, a literary periodical called Kollol performed the role of the mouthpiece of a group of young artists who, under the influence of Sigmund Freud mainly, delved into the themes of human aggression and desire in a manner that even Rabindranath Tagore could not approve. The short-lived Kollol era was quickly followed by a decisive break in the Bengali realistic fiction when Manik Bandyopadhyay's tales particularly invoke the intensities of human existence against an all-consuming social order. Both Conrad and Bandyopadhyay drill holes in their literary narratives in order to see what lies behind. Such an aesthetic takes the text away from representational narrative so that it could sound like, I quote, one of those impossible languages which sometimes we hear in our dreams, unquote, as told of the intonation of the Negro in an outpost of progress. As both authors are interested in the connection between strategies of affiliation and styles of art, their art suspects the deceit in social and cultural securities to life, for art is here aware of its own deceitfulness. The significance of Conrad's works to post-colonial writing can be discerned in terms of a fictional attempt emphasized by Guy Deleuze to seek to contact outside of established structures and to reveal that nothing is so securely hemmed in. Moreover, a Conradian text draws its creative energy by making it necessary to introduce voids and white spaces and subvert our confidence in the coded world. An outpost of progress and the lagoon explored the experience of capture and containment of individual characters, most complexly reflected by the lagoon itself. The act of speaking about oneself, others, or particular aspects of the world involves a set of assumptions and understanding, and a habitual knowledge outside of which one eventually finds hard to think. A modernist tale, on the contrary, challenges this illusion of mediating identities and respective binaries as fixed entities by the possibility of a series of alternative conditions and relations being cracked open to them. An outpost of progress opens with posing Kerr and Curlier feeling clueless outside the, I quote, the high organization of civilized crowds, unquote, by a suggestion of things vague, uncontrollable. Each of them becomes scared of the prospect of other falling sick and dying. The idea that he would perhaps have to bury Curlier and remain alone gives Kerr an inward shiver. Sickness acts as a passage between the living and the dead, also in Arshad's experience as he awaits Diamelon's death in their lonely retreat in the lagoon. However, death is that void whose fear and fascination undercut any simple binary between the living and the dead person. Thus, an outpost of progress opens, I quote, in it under a tall cross march out of the perpendicular slept the man. In the lagoon too, death is near, unavoidable, but unseen. The absence of dead one paradoxically constitutes his presence in the symbolic order to typify the lost object of experience that no representation can exhaust. As when Kerr, while gazing at Curlier's corpse, tries to reconstruct the scene by reversing their roles. Sigmund Freud opines in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which was written at the backdrop of the First World War. Fear represents a certain kind of inner state amounting to expectation of and preparation for danger of some kind. Dread requires a specific object of which we are afraid. Fright, however, describes the state that possesses us when we find ourselves plunged into danger without being prepared for it. The interplay between these three feelings undermine imperial othering in an outpost of progress, as when the fear of the unknown danger lying within the forest turns into a dread that tends to fry with the loss of the safety provided to Europeans by a tribe led by Govila. I quote, an incarnate feeling that something from within them was gone, something that had kept the wilderness from interfering with their hearts. Death in Conrad's text functions as the virtual potential for the transformation of identities. An outpost of progress as Heart of Darkness shows how the project to exterminate all the brutes results in mutual annihilation of the imperial agents themselves, disclosing the absurd and feeble order of the imperial bargain. Why did they quarrel about that sugar? How absurd. So he will begin this horror tomorrow and the day after every day until Kerr hangs himself. Deleuze's reading of a set of modernist works locates that the new arrangements of language, labor, and life to offer us a manner of diagramming the potential forms of resistance to and lines of flight from institutional stratifications. In the light of this observation, the lagoon in the lagoon is both a clearing and an entrapment. Conrad's employment of the impressionist reductionism that turns every kind of subject as still life both conceals and reflects upon a sequence of intensive states in Arsat's romance, his confrontation with the ruler, his betrayal of his brother, the resultant guilt and submission to the inevitable. Each of them seems to dwindle between the lived and the livable, to be accommodated within the signifying uses of the representational language. To release the tension of existence, Arsat thus becomes a contemplative being. But Conrad's language prevents any easy translation of knowing into meaning in life and art. I quote, Tuan, I loved my brother. We love all our brothers. Arsat burst out with an intense whispering violence. What did I care who died? I wanted peace in my own heart. So Arsat aggressively prohibits all displays of the sources of his desire and guilt. Now, in Bandyopadhyay's Burnt Turmeric, the self is transformed to uncircled territories of identity, space, and time. An absence occupies the middle of the tale, as two sensational murders defy any explanation by raising a screen between the events themselves and the speculating individuals around. One of them, a middle-aged man, Bolai Chakraborty, was found dead. His head lay cracked open. The next was the murder of the girl called Subra. She was just one of those ordinary homely girls, going to her husband's home and coming back to her furthest a month ago, heavy with child. The mystery thickens as another housewife, Damini, falls ill and starts claiming herself to be possessed by Bolai's unsatisfied spirit, which, however, assumes the responsibility of murder of Subra by employing a second body, in spite of the strong dose of burnt turmeric. The virtual killer does not disclose the name of the physical culprit. The shock and curiosity linger, for the murder turns spectral and terrifying. Now arrives a learned and rational fellow, Subra's elder brother and village schoolmaster Dhiren, who fights against all sorts of superstitions and prescribes proper treatment for Damini. But Conrad's contemplative impressionism is answered by Bandyopadhyay's dynamic expressionism at a moment of extreme and unsettling anxiety. Dhiren's superstitious wife, Shanti, puts on their courtyard a charmed bamboo pole, believed to keep the ghost away. The pole serves as a sort of magic circle of culture within which the opposition between the reason and unreason is safely played out. And by keeping the deadly, secret, and impossible, it creates an illusion of potential. But Dhiren mistakenly crosses it to go through a series of instinct, shame, guilt, fearful submission of crime, and also miserable cry for safety and security. I quote, Dhiren stood on the other side of the bamboo pole, calling out his own name in a fierce animal groan. Blood trickled down his lips. Remove the bamboo pole. I can't cross it. Remove the bamboo pole. He could not cross the bamboo pole. The pole lay on the ground. Shanti was sure now. The tale denies any clear-cut detection of the culprit. Deleuze and Guattari, in their works on Kafka, point out that language stops being representative in order to move towards its extremities. Bandyopadhyay's early existentialist work, The Right to Suicide, offers two situations connected by a short journey in the life of a lower middle-class family, consisting of the patriarch Nilmoni, his wife Niva, and their elder daughter Shama, and a little baby, Set in heavy downpour, the entire family is shown to suffer in a tatty room. Even the unquestioning submission of the family members to the situation turns unbearable to Nilmoni, whose own being is gradually subsumed by an absurdity. Sama said, "There's not much tobacco left further." Nilmoni was close to tears. His was an existence of such pervasive deprivation. How would a bout of smoking make amends for all that? With primary reservations, Nilmoni's family is forced to take shelter in an outer room of a well-off family of the neighborhood, in spite of a great degree of humiliation. But in that particular room, they make a surprising discovery, that they are to share the room with the sick uncle of their wealthy host. Nilmoni inquires about the state of the sick man, and the tale takes a paradoxical turn. "What illness is it? Can't you see?" responded the uncle, irate. "Haven't you noticed what agony it is for me to breathe?" "Why, but why would you notice it? Only a fellow sufferer would understand." Both these modern masters tell of their life at the actual micro-level performances, which deterritorialize the broadly set binaries and conformism in pursuit of the potential flow in life and art. At these levels, a search for fellow sufferers generate new creative forces to build up bonding and resistance against institutionalized dominance. These tales make us realize a basic fact of life. I go out to the other in order to come back with the self. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Subir. Again, we're all sticking very much to time, so it's really appreciated. We've got time for questions now. So what I would suggest is, if you have a question, to write it in the chat and say who you would like to address your question to. And I think we've actually got enough time that if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question to the speaker. So we've got about 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to take a break. So any takers for questions? Subir, I was interested to hear.
I'd like to ask a question.
Oh, right. Okay. Who's that?
It's Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Q. Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you all. I was particularly interested in James's talk, Royce, and you repeatedly said that you didn't like the idea of attributing Conrad's various illnesses to psychosomatic causes, because he himself didn't agree with that kind of way of looking at illness. But isn't that to be expected? Even if you have a psychosomatic illness, isn't that to be expected that you're not really going to diagnose yourself as being psychosomatically ill? Because that's the whole point of somatic symptoms, is that they are disguised, if you like, neuroses, which if you were to acknowledge them, they would not manifest themselves as illnesses.
Okay, it wasn't my main reason for objection. Psychosomatic illness, certainly people taking up a sick role or an invalid role, invalid, invalid, allows people then to take a break and not get involved in things they don't want to get involved with, or because they're psychologically or physically exhausted. And so the body will produce illness in response to psychological cause. And I don't have any doubts that Conrad had a lot of psychological issues. When you read Bernard Mayer, he traces most of the problems from childhood. And quite honestly, Joseph Conrad had an appalling childhood. And yet he was a strong person as well. He managed to become a ship's captain. He managed to have a lot of adventures, gun running. He managed to produce 30 or so works. And at much of the time, he was the strength in the situation rather than the weakness. So I see him as quite a strong character. And I didn't understand why these illnesses impacted on his life so much, especially when at times they were interfering with his wish to work, his wish to complete work, his wish to keep appointments. So there wasn't any gain to be made by not being able to do it. There wasn't any gain from the illness psychologically, as far as I could see. And that would be a requirement for psychosomatic illness in my book. The other issue that comes out of the study is that the depression follows on from the physical symptoms. So if you've got a psychosomatic illness, generally there'll be a build-up with increased anxiety and exhaustion, and then somebody will become ill. Whereas in this illness, the depression, the psychological symptoms, particularly in the latter half of his life, seem to come after the physical. And we know that lupus can cause nasty psychological and neuropsychiatric symptoms. And that's why I was attracted by the idea that it was a physical illness. The other point I want to make is that Joseph Conrad was a seeker after truth. He didn't always find it. He wanted to know the secret of the universe, but he decided there wasn't one. And I think as I read it, he decided the best thing to do was to do one's best, to keep honour and to keep going through adversity, but without really any hope of pie in the sky when you die. There's nothing of that in Conrad to me. So he was a determined person, and he was a seeker after truth. And when you read the letters, he continually wants to find out what's wrong with him. It seems to me he would accept a psychological illness if he believed it, but he didn't believe it, and I don't believe it for the same reasons.
It's interesting that in Lord Jim, I think Marlowe says at some point that that Jim is not afraid of anybody except the person that we're all afraid of, which is ourselves. Yes. So there is, I agree with you, of course, that Conrad is a seeker of truth, and he's doing his best to find it. But I mean, isn't there a barrier upon which you cannot, beyond which you cannot really hope to, shall we say, be objective, which is about oneself? So
Jim tried to redeem himself, and he succeeded, but of course died.
And just one short follow-up, because you mentioned that he had no motives. Motive is a very important, obviously a very important, factor in psychosomatic manifestations. Obviously, there's a motive for the symptoms to appear. But it's interesting that you said, a really interesting point that you made is that he doesn't shy away from revealing his ailments to strangers, to people who he's not particularly familiar with. And you said that this showed an interesting absence of motive in relation to the way that he would kind of promote himself as being sick to his publishers and so on and so forth. But I think there is a motive also there in his self-performativity, because as you say, I mean, Conrad is somebody who is, depending on his audience, he's presenting himself in a different way. And it's interesting, I think, that with strangers, what some people do is that they're more revealing to strangers than they are to their closest, to people in their lives. And the reason is that they're performing a role in, as in this case, I think, the role of spontaneity, that he's so spontaneous that he will just share his most intimate, medical, history with just anybody. I think he's just playing the role of the very spontaneous kind of, instinctive kind of man, in this case.
Yeah, I think he's being honest, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
No, I'm not saying
it means it is true.
Truth isn't. I'm not raising that question of whether it's true or not. I'm not going into that.
And I think he does use his feelings as metaphor in a lot of the stories. And I'm sure the classic is in Heart of Darkness. He uses his malaria experience to talk about the desperate state he got into. I don't doubt that at all. It's just this particular late illness, recurrent symptoms that has been dismissed in the literature as I read it. And I think that's unfair. I think that's unfair to him. I think he genuinely suffered, and I think he genuinely had a physical illness, not an emotional one. It had emotional consequences, of course. All serious illness does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an interesting discussion there. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask? Nidesh, yes, go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much to the speakers for these wonderful papers and for organizing this conference. It's wonderful to be all together at a distance. And since we're using this technological medium for the good, I had a question for Joanna and Katsuya, who wonderfully show how Conrad remains relevant to contemporary times of crisis. And since this pandemic, it's a global pandemic, but it's which has precedents, like in the Spanish flu pandemic, which provides maybe a context to the shadow line, as well as the First World War. But it is new. It is a new phenomenon because it is also a media pandemic, in the sense that the media do in a way inform the way we perceive and experience this crisis. And since Conrad had difficult and kind of ambivalent relationship with the media of his time, and question, what do you imagine be not such, but to a media cover that is kind of doubling the viral contagion by generating effects of emotional contagion, perhaps? And it's for Joanna and Katsuya, but anybody who has any thoughts on that.
I think that what is happening now, we've got a kind of virus contagion which is present, as you said, in the media, and it is connected with our presence, with our life. And when I was thinking about Conrad in this context, I realized that we can somehow transpose all what he was writing about, even if in a kind of a metaphor, we can transpose that to our present situation. And for me, it was just a great thing that what is so modern as all those social media, the internet, and so on and so forth, that we turn to what is the most basic in in humanity. So just togetherness, common feeling, common understanding, and going through hard times. That we, even if we've got all the electronic mechanisms around us, we are still as human as they were before, and probably future generation will got, if they will be able to survive and to appear, they will have the same feelings, emotions, and probably they also will be able to find in Conrad solution for their problems.
I would like to comment on this particular question or this particular observation. Yes, the human content that should be emphasized. The narratives are being constructed by media, the narratives are being constructed technologically. Technology is not all bad. We are all together because of technology. This is also a virtual platform, but virtual must come from and relate back to the actual. That is what I think that modernist masters mostly point out. Our survival is a matter of experience. It is medically, it is humanly, and we should think about new connections among ourselves at the very level of experience itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert, would you like to ask a question? You should be able to speak.
Hi. It's really an observation on Dr. Tanaka's paper, where I was struck by his comments on the the large numbers of deaths and the problem of representing those in relation to World War I. But Conrad had already thought about that in relation to the Russo-Japanese War. And you can see him contemplating that in some of his written responses to that, in Autocracy and War, and also in some of his letters around that time.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. But so as you said, so Conrad himself had thought about the war, in particular the war between Japan and Russia in 1905. But so a point to note is that so how much he was dedicated to the World War I. As I said in my presentation, so his son Boris was engaged in the war, and so Conrad himself was deeply, let's say so, influenced or feel something about the World War I. So I'm sorry, it is difficult to arrange my ideas, but what is it? So intense, let's say, the depth of his idea or depth of his feelings is completely different between his idea about the World War I and that of the Japanese Russo War. I'm sorry, so I have to wait for a while. Thank you. I'm truly sorry. So my line's a little bit busy. So
Okay, should we move on? I'm not sure if the line is too difficult for Dr. Katsuwa. Okay, so we've had some interesting comments in the chat function, which I don't know if anybody can see that. But we have a question from Amrita Banerjee,
Okay,
Dr.
yes.
Subir Dhar Ray.
I just see Helen's hand up too. Yeah.
Because we're across 3 screens, so I can't see everybody.
Oh, right, yes, yeah.
But Amrita Banerjee, would you like to ask the question? You can unmute yourself. Okay, well, the question is, so we know that most of Conrad's novels depicting the courage and spirit of humans in the midst of nature's fury, but in his short stories, The Lagoon, it somehow represents betrayal, remorse, death, and the murkiness of the human condition. Do you think that his novels and his short stories contradict each other in their main themes and depiction? It's a big question.
I will make it short. I will make the answer short. Yes, actually what I find that Conrad's novels continuously pushes narrative to the extreme point. And this extreme point is actually reflecting the intensities of human states. And these intensities of human states leads to for me, to the post-colonial writers, to the new writers, those who followed the Conradian train, to think about new solidarity, to think about the regeneration of human bonding. And as all the papers of this first technical session reflected on that, we are refining Conrad from our own context, which is also a context of fighting against nature's fury, fighting against our own faults and everything. But we learn from Conrad. We learn from the modernist masters how to critically and also creatively recreate ourselves, recreate our bonds beyond the extremes, to think beyond the line. That is what I find that Conrad present for me. Thank you.
Very nicely put. We've got time for one more question from Helen Chambers, and then we're going to take a break. So Helen? Helen, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, okay, just only 10 seconds, just simply to say to Royce Murphy, while not disagreeing at all with Nick's comments, I'm so glad you've done this work, because I totally agree with you. I'm an ex-doctor too, you see, so who became a Conrad Scholar, I'm totally agree with you on at least a complex autoimmune disorder, if not SLE or some variant of that, possibly exacerbated by, by his tropical diseases in the Congo as well, maybe. But I'm fully in agreement with you. That's all. Thank you for doing that, because I've been wanting to do it for a long time, but have, got distracted.
Okay, we're going to take a break now. So we've got about 3 minutes to past. But could I ask that the speakers for the second panel come or stay online, and your chair is going to be Tanya Zulli. So if you could stay online and we can just check that your sharing screen works. If everybody else could just mute themselves while you go on a break, and we will meet you back online at 3:40 p.m. sharp to start again. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of our speakers for opening up the conference, and for actually doing something, and especially Joanna for starting something which I think this is rather experimental for all of us. So thank you very much for beginning that, and thank you to all of you. Silent applause. Okay, we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Right, for some reason, Catherine, you're sharing your screen with us.
Catherine, can you take your shared screen off?
Okay, I've managed to work out how to do it.
Oh, great.
Right. Okay.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Ellen. How's the hurricane?
Unmute. How's the hurricane?
Which one? The joke going around New Orleans is that 2 hurricanes and a corona is a drink order and not a forecast, right?
So we've got Jose Gonzalez, I can see down at the bottom of my screen here. Helen, Ellen, Douglas, are you all there? Now, Catherine, we're going to have to tell Catherine off for constantly showing her screen. Right, I've got rid of her again. It's not personal, Catherine. Okay, so Tanya, I'm going to pass over to you, and I'm going to shut up now.
Okay, thank you very much, dear. Okay, in the next. Hello, Catherine.
Tanya.
No, it's Catherine again.
Catherine wants to share her things with us. Okay, the second panel, there are 4 speakers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, shall we try your screen sharing so that, I mean, if you have any slides to share. Jose?
I got nothing. It's just gonna be reading.
Okay, very good. And Helen Chambers?
Oh, dozens of them. I only ever use slides. Okay. So what do you want to do?
Just try and share the slides with us.
Okay. At this point, then I go to.
You go to the bottom of the screen.
Ah, yes. But oh, sorry, mine's in French. Yes, partager l'écran. Yes. Okay. And then I have to find my own thing. Yes, should be on there. Yep. And share again there. Okay, and then I'll be able to then put it on the full slideshow.
That's great.
I'll be able to put it. Let me see if it would make sure it works on the full screen. Yeah, hang on. Yeah, I'll just have to go. I'll be able to do that.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay. Now I can go out of that.
Great. Fantastic.
Okay. And can you see my pointer, by the way?
Yes.
because I've got maps to show.
Yeah, we can
Okay.
see everything.
Okay,
Perfect.
so that's
Thank
done.
you very
So I
much.
can minimize that and go out of that. Okay.
That's
Mine
great.
just says that my screen sharing is on hold. It's paused, I think.
Okay, that's good.
Maybe it's gone, yeah.
Okay, Ellen Harrington, have you got any slides you want to share? Hello.
I like Jose, I decided not to do it this time, so.
Fantastic, that's great. And Douglas, hello there.
Yes, hello. I do, I'm trying now, okay? There we go. That looks all right.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
seems fine. Slideshow.
Exactly.
Yep, should be okay. Right.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much, Douglas.
I'm not quite sure how to put it off now.
Yeah.
Oh, it's gone. Okay.
Okay. Let me just ask you to be on time, please. So to, speak for 15 minutes, and then we will have the Q&A session at the end. And yeah, I think we're right there. We will start in 7 minutes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you have questions or doubts or things you want to solve, I'm here. Otherwise, we can just have a 5 minutes break and be back.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. Okay, we're all here. A couple of minutes. Hamed Oneini on the chat is asking for a good biography of Conrad's. Maybe our veterans could suggest some. I don't dare.
Neither is still the best. Neither's a chronicle is still the best by far. No dispute.
Oh, sorry.
Catherine.
Absolutely agree with you, Hugh.
Catherine.
Oh, Catherine, are you back? Okay, as soon as we get hold of our screen, we could start. Hello, Alan.
Hello, darling. How are you?
I'm fine. So glad to see you.
On the biography front, I think the introductions to the collected letters make, if you read them in order, they make a very good introduction as well.
True. Thank you so much.
And if you want a sort of short introduction, Cedric Watts's preface to Conrad is very good.
Yes.
The Longman book, if you want a short one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, could you unshare your screen?
Oh dear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Cedric, could you please unshare your screen?
Yay.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay then, welcome back. I think we can start with this second session. We have 4 speakers, and the first speaker is Jose Gonzalez. Jose is a Marine Engineer Officer of the Merchant Navy and Naval Architect. He's Fellow of the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology, and Fellow of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. He is member of the Joseph Conrad Society UK, and this is the second time that he participates in a Joseph Conrad International Conference. He presented a paper at the 42nd annual conference held in Edinburgh, Napier University, UK. The title of his paper today is Notes on Life, the Mental Bulkheads Against Marine Establishments and Fanfare. Jose, if you just want to unmute. Oh, I should do that. Where are you? Oh, yes, you are unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay, then. And you don't have a screen to share, do you? Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tanya. Good day, everybody. East and West. Is Jose Gonzalez from the WET Rotterdam in Northern Europe. Before commencing the lecturing of the paper, I would like to thank to the Joseph Conrad Society to give me the opportunity again for participating in this session and hopefully enriching the contents with this shipping angle. So, notes on life, the mental battles against the marine establishment and fanfare. Joseph Conrad was 55 years old when Titanic sank in 1912. His career in the Merchant Navy spanned 19 years. He served in different ranks and ship types, not in the most advanced ones in those days. But it's for sure that he gained a vast seafaring experience. After the Titanic accident, several commissions were engaged in the investigation of the incident, being the most relevant the one occurring in the US. The incident profoundly shocked the society, both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and aimed to provide answers to something that happened in the past. Marine casualties, plenty of times. But that one in 1912 acquired a completely new dimension due to the number of losses and the wrecking of a vessel categorized as unsinkable. The event was so relevant that led to the drafting of one of the most important regulations related to safety of lives at sea, SOLAS, which is still in place. Joseph Conrad adopted a very proactive and responsible role, not only providing his reflections and views on the topic, also questioning some aspects of the inquiry led by the commission in charge. His knowledge and experience provided a pragmatic vision based on his days as seafarer and his passion for the sea. So he refuted the arguments all the parties put in place. Those parties were the ones directly linked to the marine establishment in all these corners. And not only that, he also dared to question the way how the things were done. This is something he could easily avoid. In 1912, he already had several years of relation with other prominent writers as Ford Madoz Ford, and they shared agents at both sides of the ocean. He had already published a good number of works, so perhaps the easiest way for someone in his social position would be to stay quiet and silent, maybe waiting 2 or 3 years more to provide a mild analysis of the circumstances and conclusions in line with the media and industry. But it was not that way. He rushed to provide his views at the same time almost the investigation was happening. He provided an analysis and review against 2 main actors who played a role in different stages of his life. The marine establishment he worked for during 19 years, and the media that poured the news feeding the social mass that read his books. Joseph Conrad dared to challenge some of the parts of these 2 stakeholders, and he did that in a clear and concise manner. It's completely impossible for us to know what he was thinking and how he prepared himself during the preliminary steps before writing those works. The present article intends to identify the approach he followed for questioning all those aspects of the admirable investigation. The marine establishment and the fanfare. Joseph Conrad clearly identifies in the certain aspects of the admirable inquiry into the loss of the Titanic 1912 all the different characters that participated in the investigation. He addressed perfectly the roles and responsibilities, and in fact is something that is not new for him since he knows perfectly the trade from inside. Quote, the senators of the commission had absolutely no knowledge and no practice to guide them in the conduct of such an investigation. Board of Trade and its experienced president discovered a very interesting fact that the watertight doors in the bulkheads of that wonder of naval architecture could be opened down below by any irresponsible person. The technicians responsible for the Titanic persuaded themselves that a ship not divided by watertight compartments could be unsinkable. Joseph Conrad refers to the watertight bulkheads and compartments, but following an approach from a pure technical angle, quite different from the one that this paper is considered. He continued with the lawyers representing various interests and the comparison he established with the bravos of ancient Venice and their stilettos. The responsible of the designing the ship is another piece of the marine establishment he was challenging and he identified, and perhaps the most obvious one. And in one single go, he listed solemn experts, exhaustive directors, glorified ticket sellers, and officials of all sorts. In addition, he didn't spare all kinds of adjectives, ironic ones, for the aforementioned stakeholders, like a high priest of the modern cult of perfected material and mechanical appliances, priests of an oracle which has failed but still must remain the oracle. The assumption is that they are minister of progress, Pooh-Bah, or finally, when he compares the structural integrity of the Titanic with the Huntley and Palmer can. There is a sentence in the text that perfectly summarizes the fanfare and the marine establishment in one go. I only object to the attitude of the people who, having called her into being and having romance, to speak politely about her, assume a detached sort of superiority, goodness only knows why, and raise difficulties in the way of every suggestion, difficulties about boats, about bulkheads, about discipline, about davits, all sorts of difficulties. He agglutinated both sides in one single argument to emphasize the importance of those two in the judgment of the whole picture. Joseph Conrad mental bulkheads. One of the most relevant and more debated aspects of the investigation was about her bulkheads. One evidence was that the way they were designed and built did not provide full watertight gas spaces in the case of a collision. Joseph Conrad challenged the investigation and its main actors, and to do that he offered well-structured arguments about technical and human topics based on his career at sea and his continued curiosity about the new developments happening in marine industry in those days. He systematically challenging the establishment and the fanfare as presented before by means of those mental bulkheads identified. But what is a mental bulkhead? In this work, it refers to a portion of knowledge well based on experience and education that allows someone to provide a precise and accurate judgment about something. Joseph Conrad mental bulkheads are nothing more than a number of characteristics, thoughts, reflections, deliberations, which maybe will help us to better understand the author and his works about the Titanic loss, something we may extrapolate maybe to other topics and aspects of his life. Two main types of mental bulkheads have been identified for the preparation of this paper, the professional ones and the personal ones. The difference among them is their nature, the source where they are coming from. Let me commence with the professional ones. Quote, I've been taken to task by a friend of mine on the other side for my strictures on Senator Smith's investigation into the loss of the Titanic in the number of the English Review for May 1912. This is the beginning of the work, and it's a demonstration that Joseph Conrad is a good comrade. He's a mate. He's a generous with his friends, since reacts to their calls even coming from the other side of the ocean. In a more obvious note, it's the fire and water obsession any seafarer has or has had. Quote, and if you were to discover on closer inspection that these bulkheads closed no more than 2/3 of the openings they were meant to close, leaving above a space through which drove smoke and fire could rush from one end of the building to the other? What would you think of the intelligence and candor of these advertising people? What would you think of them? And yet, apart from the obvious difference in the action of fire and water, the cases are essentially the same. The third one is about his deep knowledge related to the roles on board and the current status in those days and what was about to come. And talking of stakeholders, firemen and trimmers, men whose heavy labor has not a single redeeming feature, which is unhealthy and surprising, are those aspiring, are those without the reward of personal pride in it, share, hard, brutalizing toil, belonging neither to the sea, neither to earth, nor to sea, I greet with joy the adventure for marine purpose of the internal combustion engines. But not only about roles, when he writes about davits, boats, cargo derricks, etc. He exudes a profound technical knowledge of seafaring life and techniques, irrespectively of ship type. Joseph Conrad wrote in his work, Tomorrow, people did not know what they let their boys in for them when they let them go to sea. This sentence provides the essence of the amplitude of what the experience going on board is, something Joseph Conrad knew and remembered quite well. So Joseph Conrad felt disappointed when a bunch of guys wearing the expert's hat did a mere and mild analysis of the catastrophe of Titanic. The other type of mental health that has been identified is the personal one. This one acquires an extraordinary relevance in the case of a so complex author as Joseph Conrad. He's a resilient person. Quote, I'm not a soft-headed humanitarian faddist. I've been ordered in my time to do dangerous work. I have ordered others to do dangerous work. And from there, we could also conclude that he's also a pragmatic individual who approaches the topics in a neutral manner, and what it shows is faithful to the course of the event he sets out of the speak, without fuss or imposture. He utilizes observation and practical scientific methods for the theories and arguments. He states, and I know what I'm talking about. Only 6 weeks ago, I was on the river in an ancient rough ship's boat, fit with a 2-cylinder motor engine of 7.5 horsepower, with a common ship boat, which the man who owns her uses for taking the workmen and stevedores to and from the ship's loading at the buoys of Greenhithe. And continues, these two youngsters, at my request, kept her stationary for 10 minutes with a touch of engine and helm now and then. So he bases his theories in observation, and he's not reactive to new technologies or equipment. The other way around, he's very open-minded to new techniques tested with utmost rigor by himself. And finally, he's well-informed, visionary. Don't you think that with all the mechanical contrivances, with all the generated power on board these ships, it's about time to get rid of the hundreds years old mean power appliances? He perfectly identified that nowadays is the norm, but those days only few were able to figure out. A century later, it's easy for us to properly address the remarkable value of Joseph Conrad's work. Is mainly due to the invaluable contribution that represented in those days when no one else questioned the accident and its investigation. Not only that, Joseph Conrad had the courage to provide his views during those extremely dynamic times for the marine industry, with the incoming of internal combustion engines and other kind of devices that fell out of his experience, but he analyzed and evaluated in a rigorous fashion to provide his accurate views. The quick reaction from this work to the investigation is easy to conclude that Joseph Conrad was a former seafarer that, even having spent already a good number of years ashore, he was still scouting all the new technologies appearing in the horizon and being implemented shyly in some areas in the industry. But he utilized his mental balance not only to challenge the industry, also to demonstrate that the vector conformed by technology, knowledge, safety was heavily unbalanced in those days. It's not the objective of this paper to run a psychological analysis of Joseph Conrad almost a century later of his decease. That would be impossible and not opportune. But by means of analyzing his work, a number of mental balance have been identified. We can draw a sketch of Joseph Conrad's complex personality, firstly as a seafarer, secondly as an individual, and thirdly as an author who writes one of the most remarkable works of British literature on the late 19th century and early 20th. The review and study of this aspect acquires special relevance when marine industry is about to face similar challenges in the year to come. Most of the time, the events are being trumpeted with massive fanfare by the same actor that Conrad challenged in Notes of Life with his mental balance. Annotation. This article is dedicated to all the seafarers that have been and still are stranded on board during the COVID pandemic. They have made possible to secure the traffic of goods around the globe and avoid that the impact of the pandemic in our lives could be even bigger. Different times, different issues, but same Notes on Life. Thank you.
Let me just introduce you Ellen Harrington. who is department chair and professor of English at the University of South Alabama, and is the book reviewer editor at Conradiana. She has published on gender and popular fiction in the work of Joseph Conrad, as well as on Victorian sensation fiction and on detective fiction more broadly. She is the author of Conrad's Sensational Heroines, Gender and Representation in the Late Fiction of Joseph Conrad, published with Palgrave in 2017. Ellen's paper will be about Aissa's curse in An Outcast of the Islands. Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks so much to Kim and the Society. This is tremendous to be part of this conference now, and much appreciated. So thanks for all of the work on it. Andrew Francis and I chatted about Aissa at conferences years apart. So Andrew, I finally went back to look at the start of an idea here. Your words are worse than the poison of snakes, Aissa exclaims, upon finding herself humiliatingly abandoned in a trite romantic triangle with Willems and his previously abandoned wife, albeit a triangle where Aissa will wind up holding the revolver. Willems' downfall and its implications for Lingard are the crux of the plot in An Outcast of the Islands. The visceral power of its imperial critique might lie most forcefully with its betrayed Muslim heroine, Aissa, who confronts the seductive power of the snake in her desolate garden. In Outcast, Conrad draws strongly on the Gothic tradition, echoing both the imperial Gothic of Haggard's She in the bold presence of Aissa's enchanting, commanding desire, as well as playing on the tropes of haunting and confinement, common to the European women of Victorian Gothic fiction, even as Willems' attitude anticipates the narrator's pleasure in both the conquest of and eroticized disgust for the degraded heroine Alice of A Smile of Fortune. Aissa inverts the power dynamic of Willems' marriage, initially gazing upon Willems as a prelude to conquest and possession, as Susan Barras notes in a comparison to writer Haggard's Aisha in She. Like Aisha, Aissa cannot maintain control over the European man she desires. Unlike Lena of Victory, who dies in the grip of illusions about the elevated value of self-sacrificing femininity, Aissa develops a cutting self-awareness in the final scenes of the novel, articulating her positioning and advocating on behalf of Willems to Lingard, in realizing her degradation as the slave of a slave. Because she is second to the lawful wife of Willems, Aissa ultimately kills Willems in bitter victory over her own illusory possession, a sensational rebellion against the profound nature of her imperial dispossession. Notable for the ways in which the treatment of Aissa resonates with that of European women elsewhere in Conrad, these scenes disrupt the expected colonial hierarchy, offering a striking gender critique in an atmosphere of Gothic excess. From the opening pages of the novel, Conrad invites the reader's disdain for Willems in a magnificent series of indictments of the colonial hierarchy, as Willems proceeds, quote, to tyrannize good-humoredly over his half-caste wife, to notice with tender contempt his pale yellow child, to patronize loftily his dark-skinned brother-in-law. Willems' home life enacts the colonial practice of subjugating Victorian domesticity. We glimpse his abusive relationship with his wife, Joanna, as he assumes a dominating position with assurance in his rectitude and pleasure in his cruelty. But here the notice and patronizing manner of the Victorian drawing room are tinged with the language of race, as Willems surveys his family with contempt and pleasure in the way their cruelly compelled subservience reinforces his own status. Joanna's contemptuous response to the downfall of the self-anointed great man invites the reader's sympathy with her relief. I can breathe now, she says. The woman whom the novel implies was abused by Willems so mercilessly that she only rebelled once. Reflecting on the situation offhand to himself earlier, Willems commented on his abuse of Joanna with wry aloofness. It had frightened the soul out of her body, apparently. This foreshadows the subjugated European women we find in the archipelago in Conrad's later tales. The wooden Mrs. Schomburg, beaten into impassivity, and yet having no alternative but to scheme to retain her bleak position. Or the desolate Laughing Anne, relieved to be with a man, however degraded, who does not abuse her when drunk. Illegitimate masculine authority over women operates without check in these isolated communities, and Conrad demonstrates the traumatic effects of systematic abuse of women in several of the Malay fictions. If Kurtz's horror is explicitly about Western colonial violence and enslavement, and more implicitly about the treatment of women, Willems's torment, the result of his betrayals of Lingard and others, may be seen as framed specifically through his treatment of women. By focusing on the particularities of domestic life in An Outcast of the Islands, Conrad draws parallels with the abuse of women more broadly, including European women, in ways that mark masculine authority as illegitimate. In contrast to the otherworldly aspects of imperial Gothic novels like She, Outcast offers a glimpse of intimacy with Joanna and Aissa as Willems's household companions and lovers outside of the resolutely Gothic qualities of his encompassing erotic attachment with Aissa. The banal brutality of daily interactions with Willems, from his drunken midnight pontificating in search of an audience, to his manipulation of Aissa's attachment and their final desolation, demonstrates the horror of abusive relationships and gives lie to the pretense of benevolent paternalism in the home or in the empire. His wife's dismissal, with its contemptuous plea and its implicit curse, sets the stage for a haunting. The previously self-assured Willems imagines himself tortured and cursed by his fascination with Aissa, commenting, "She found out something in me, she tormented me." Willems casts his passion as a kind of Gothic confinement, heightened by the Christian imagery of Eden and the temptation by the devil, who, quote, tests the steadfastness of men's hearts. Clearly, the deposed Willems is ripe for the kind of passion that might distract him from his lost prospects, buttressing the fantasy of promise in his new life. As Barras notes, by assuming the passive role, Willems can deny responsibility for his own actions. And she develops the comparison with Haggard's Aisha. Conrad's Aissa inverts the expected subjugation of women in, quote, a sadomasochistic performance in which the native woman becomes the conqueror, whilst the European colonizer is transformed into the conquered. Indeed, Willems takes pleasure in submission, allowing himself to be borne along by his passions and embodying the fears and pleasures surrounding white men going native in the Imperial Gothic. Initially, this is the counterpoint to his marriage, since he does not perpetually assert his race and masculinity and domination over Aissa. Instead, he follows her, enthralled by a passion he views as stimulating and degrading. A Smile of Fortune also highlights the pleasures of submission to a passion tinged with disgust in the young captain's irrealizable desire. The eroticized Alice, white, but the degraded daughter of a circus performer, is captive in her walled garden, yet snarling and superb and barely clad in the captain's eyes. Though the story is enmeshed with the world of trade, Alice's fairy tale-like embowerment recalls the trope of Gothic imprisonment. Like her mother, she rejects social proprieties, but Alice is doomed to remain in her father's benevolent captivity, fearful of men and stunted in development. The captain's fascination with what he sees as the erotic directness of Alice is characterized as an enslaving addiction. Troubled, ashamed, eager, finding in my nearness to her a unique sensation which I indulged with dread, self-contempt, and deep pleasure, as if it were a secret vice bound to end in my undoing, like the habit of some drug or other which ruins and degrades its slave. The captain's desire is extinguished when it's returned by Alice, as he cruelly deserts her to her seclusion after claiming an answering kiss, a missed kiss, disgusted by his own fascination. This isolated garden embodies the Gothic trope of being locked in or locked out. Sarah Ellis defines the Gothic story in part as portraying the violence done to familial bonds that is frequently directed against women, and probing the damaging effect of romantic illusions. Here, the captain's illusion about himself, especially his privilege and his capacity for cruelty, are core to his shame, and he flees, paying his debts to the father with barely a thought for the effects of his behavior on the imprisoned daughter. Indeed, Alice is the scapegoat for her father's inappropriate passion, which is now safely sequestered, as she is used to further his business interests by compromising the reputation of the young captain. In An Outcast of the Islands, Aissa, though also influenced by the alliances of her father and his political fortunes, has distinguished herself as an individual of strength and loyalty, described as the girl with the steadfast heart. Willems's initial shock of passion, described masochistically as tingling with that feeling, which begins like a caress and ends in a blow, ends in Aissa describing their racial positioning. I'm the daughter of the blind Omar, and you are the white trader, the great man of this place. Conrad gives Aissa, who is speaking sincerely, the same language that Joanna used in mocking him earlier. Aissa both creates her own unfounded illusions about Willems and his heroic potential, and recognizes a vulnerability that she can exploit. She could not understand all he told her of his life, but the fragments she understood, she made up for herself into a story of a man great amidst his own people. Valorous and unfortunate, an undaunted fugitive dreaming of vengeance against his enemies, ready to be enslaved. In this way, Conrad uses Aissa to explore the familiar Conradian theme of the ways in which characters' illusions insulate them from understanding and intimacy. Like other heroines, Aissa protects her own romantic fantasies, projects her own romantic fantasies, but they are coupled with a strategic desire to improve her lot in life as Willems's lover. Unlike Lena of Victory, Aissa is not interested in making a romantic gesture demonstrating her commitment. She wants more control. The initial erotic fulfillment of Aissa and Willems in their relationship is also described negatively as a deadly happiness, like every corruption. It was the voice of madness, of a delirious peace, of a happiness that is infamous, cowardly, and so exquisite that the debased mind refuses to contemplate its termination. For to the victims of such happiness, the moment of its ceasing is the beginning afresh of the torture, which is its price. Willems's passion is intermingled with suffering and the loss of his pose of authority, which eventually leaves him bereft and weaker than before. As Patrick O'Malley notes, the subject of the Gothic is so often the haunting of the mind itself rather than any particular structure. And the terror here is not just the nature of this remote colonial world and what has occurred there, but the emptiness of Willems and his petty tyrannies. If Conrad's novels can be read as botched romances in which adventure turns sour or squalid, undermined by moral frailty, according to Patrick Breitlinger, An Outcast thematizes the masculine frailty and susceptibility that underpin the pretense of racial and moral authority. Unable to attempt even the kind of belated self-reflection of a Kurtz who contemplates his life at the moment of death, Willems dies in yet another risky gambit, like the grifter he is. Aissa's life of adventure, fights, hails of gunfire, pulling her weight, and an escape vessel, points at an alternative kind of history for a woman that surprises Lingard as she boldly queries, "What more have you done?" Even with the relatively limited development of her character and discussion of her past life, it is clear that Aissa should be deserving of Lingard's respect, though her gender is an insurmountable barrier. Even her daring questioning of Lingard must be prefaced by and followed by a performance of submission to him. However, after Almayer's descriptions of her savagery and impropriety, Lingard is surprised by her penetration. A consuming desire to understand him fully and counter the threat he represents, even though it is a threat she imperfectly understands. Lingard's view of Aissa is resolutely limited to the exterior he perceives as savage, her bold voice and her possessive intimacy with Willems. Yet Lingard felt discontented and surprised. Unexpectedly, he had come upon a human being, a woman at that, who had made him disclose his will before its time. She should have his life, meaning, of course, Willems's life. Though she is not an equal, Lingard accepts Aissa's argument, and her negotiation with Lingard succeeds. His desire not to let Willems go, to effectively free him by letting him disappear forever in the faint blue smoke of a pistol shot, overcomes Lingard, and he makes the promise to Aissa that he will let Willems live as a punishment rather than a mercy, landing a punch rather than firing the revolver. It is, of course, Aissa who will fire the revolver in retribution, maddened by Willems's betrayal. Joanna's unexpected return lowers Aissa's precarious position even more, and the sight of these two women facing off to gain possession of the weakened, corpse-like Willems has an almost comic quality. If Joanna and Lingard have let him off, Aissa cannot. Conrad depicts this in terms of a kind of atavistic, racialized degeneration, with her dead father saying in her ear, "Kill, kill." Kren comments perceptively that Aissa's victory becomes her loss. We leave her maddened perspective for the revolver shot, shifting back to the imperceptive Williams, who is unaware that he's received a mortal shot and unable to reflect on his life. He dies in a moment, ironically thinking that he succeeded again. Missed by heaven, thought so. Early in the novel, Almayer presciently warns Williams, but you have thrown your soul away for nothing. Flung it under the feet of a damned savage woman who has made you already the thing that you are and will kill you very soon, one way or another, with her love or with her hate. Williams is already a liar and a cheat, but Almayer sees Williams's cursed passion as far more dangerous. Foreshadowing William's murder by his lover heightens the Gothic quality of the novel, even as it highlights the political stakes for his submission to her. Kryn argues that Williams's infatuation affects Aissa as a political victory over him, noting Aissa's outspoken criticism of the West and the injustice of the double standard for women. Indeed, for all the markers of her alterity, this pirate's daughter resolutely troubles the colonial hierarchy and asserts her desires and ambition with regard to Williams. By framing his downfall partly in terms of his domestic politics, Conrad gives Aissa's plotting and her complaints unexpected weight. Though she fits certain stereotypes about colonial women, Aissa is not a raging Bertha from Jane Eyre, confined to the attic and repressed for much of the plot, but the outraged woman who succeeds in pulling the trigger and making Williams disappear forever, in Lingard's phrase. Though such passion would have been difficult to sustain, what a shame that Nina succeeded at the end in taming her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you for this interesting reading of Conrad's Aissa. Okay, our next speaker is Douglas Kerr. Douglas, are you there? Can you unmute and yes, start your screen sharing. Here you are.
Good.
Okay, so Douglas Kerr is honorary professor of English at the University of Hong Kong and honorary research fellow at Birkbeck, University of London. He's the author of books about Wilfred Owen, George Orwell, Arthur Conan Doyle, and British colonial literature, and of some dozen essays about Conrad. Today, Douglas is going to speak about two strong men, Gaspar Ruiz and Eugene Sandow.
Thank you, Tanya. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, and thanks to Kim and the rest for organizing this conference and inviting me. This paper is called Two Strong Men. It's a phrase that I take from Kipling's Ballad of East and West, but there is neither east nor west, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, for they come from the ends of the earth. And my question in this paper is, what does the strong man mean? And I'm asking this question in relation to two strong men. One is Gaspar Ruiz on the left, the South American partisan fighter in the story of he's the eponym of a story in Conrad's A Set of Six, published in 1908, a story that Conrad described as warlike in its feeling, My other strong man is Eugene Sandow, a professional strongman and a late Victorian Edwardian celebrity performer and businessman. So what does the strong man mean? I'm going to try and summarize this longish paper to begin with, and then I'll just read the last 2 pages of it. What does the strong man mean? In early literature and culture, in what we might call epic culture, the answer to this is simple enough, is it not? Strong men were heroes, and heroes were strong, and we think of semi-divine heroes like Hercules or the warriors Ajax and Achilles in the Iliad. But in the age of modern weaponry, this doesn't really obtain anymore. This kind of strength is no longer paramount. There's a moment in one of the Indiana Jones films in which Indiana is confronted with a huge man in the Arab costume wielding a scimitar in the street, and Indiana Jones simply takes out his pistol and shoots him. So that's the end of the strong man. So this kind of strength is no longer paramount. So the strong man in modern times becomes a much more interesting figure, I think, something of an anachronism, even something of a clown. Some of you may be old enough to remember this guy from Blazing Saddles. His name is Mongo. So the strong man in modern times is often regarded as rather thick, someone who can't really cope in modernity. So I think with Gaspar Ruiz, the strong man, who in the early parts of the story, although he's quite respected by Santierra, who's the main, not the narrator of the entire story, but the partial narrator, he has some respect for Gaspar Ruiz, but also in the early parts of the tale considers Gaspar almost as a figure of fun, a kind of hulking peasant, very strong, but intellectually out of his depth, even in the army. Gaspar Ruiz has joined the war by mistake, as Santierra sees him. And Santierra is a very sophisticated narrator, looking on Gaspar Ruiz as a bit of a peasant hulk. These are just two moments when Santierra when he's being described. Gaspar, his mind was hardly active enough to take a discriminating view of the advantages or perils of treachery. He didn't understand heroism, but it was his intention to throw his musket away at the first opportunity. So there's a sense in which the strong man doesn't really have an intellectual life at all. However, he is strong and he's a spectacle. Gaspar Ruiz in the early parts of the story performs feats of heroic strength, which are admired, but also always slightly ridiculous, I think. However, as the tale goes on, and especially after Gaspar meets the royalist Herminia, whom he eventually will marry, he starts to present rather differently. And I think this is to do with the way that Conrad originally thought of these as a set of tales rather than a single tale. Gaspar becomes a more romantic and quixotic figure, and with this comes a romantic language. Santierra says of him, when speaking of his courtship of Herminia, he tried to melt her icy heart in a stream of warm blood. Very romantic. And Gaspar himself, after his wife has been captured, I would get her back if she were hidden in the very heart of the mountain. So he's now a romantic figure, but also a quixotic one. He's doomed to failure. He becomes a partisan leader in the hills. Eventually his strength, great as ever, becomes almost tragic. He's fighting in a siege to free his wife and baby daughter. He offers his own massive body as the carriage for a field gun. This gun has lost its stand, so it can't be fired. So Gaspar gets on all fours and they put the carriage over his back and fire it. Of course, a rather dangerous operation, in the course of which his back is broken, he dies, the battle is lost. And among his dying words, he utters the phrase, "not strong enough," not strong enough. Meanwhile, here is Eugene Sandow. There he is, feast your eyes. Eugene Sandow was a nobody from Prussia who rises to fame, first in London, later in the States, and then globally, as a music hall performer, a music hall strongman and star entertainer on both sides of the Atlantic. He was one of the great attractions of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So he performed strength, and very successfully, both in terms of fame and commercial success. He became a friend of the rich and famous. Sandow was his own subject. He stages himself as a spectacle, and an increasingly sophisticated one. His acts on stage became more and more complex, and he started to perform little stories, often based on classical myth. So he's a spectacle, but of course an empty one. What does his strength mean? Well, it's nothing really. Nothing is at stake in it. It's just show business. In the course of his developing his brand and developing his stage show, he deliberately evokes the image of primitive and classical strongmen. And this is a specific one. This is the Farnese Hercules, which is in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, which of course features elsewhere in the set of six. And this is Sandow. So he takes his performances are often backgrounded with reproductions of classical statues, and often reproduce those statues. There we go. very deliberately, so that he's acquiring, or he's, yes, bringing to himself something of the prestige of the classical strongman and the classical physique, which becomes something which he then promotes and actually sells as part of his show. So what does the strongman mean in Sandow's case? It is an aesthetic spectacle, of course, though some would say a vulgar one, certainly very popular. It is clearly, this is not actually spelled out, but it's clearly a sexual display as well. He was particularly popular among women, and on some of his tours, latterly on most of his tours, he used to invite ladies, after the performance, he used to invite ladies into his dressing room where they could feel his muscles. So it's a sexual display in some respects, but also it's a display of good health. The point about the strong body is that it was a healthy body, a body in which all of the muscles were performing to their optimum. And this becomes part of the Sandow brand. So he begins to diversify into fitness programs, dietary things, and so on. He's, in a sense, the Joe Wicks of his time. With his displays based on classical strength, he's offering an anachronistic image, but now in a different sense, in a positive sense. Gaspar Ruiz is anachronistic in the sense of really not belonging in the modern world, the modern war and modern weaponry. Sandow is anachronistic in that he's offering deliberately to revive something of the past. He's offering to revive the strong body of the ancient world in himself and in others. And he gives this description of his inspiration. It's almost certainly not true, but he remembers being taken by his father to a museum to look at classical statues. I remember asking my father if people were as well developed in these modern times. He pointed out they were not, and explained that these were the figures of men who lived when might was right, when men's own arms were their weapons and often their lives depended upon the physical strength. They knew nothing of the modern luxuries of civilization, and besides their training and exercise, their muscles in the ordinary course of daily life were always being brought prominently into play. So the point is that in modernity, we have lost this. We no longer need to be strong, and therefore we're not as healthy as they were, apparently, in the ancient world. So this is now what Sandow has to offer and to sell as the strong man. He introduced the universal system of physical culture, which he said the aim was to bring back to existence the lost physical prestige of the ancients. So he's capitalizing on the prestige of the ancients, but he's also, as it were, selling it. And then we get this, and you'll recognize the idiom. My aim is to raise the average standard of the race as a whole. Healthier and more perfect men and women ought to beget children with constitutions free from hereditary taint. They in their turn will grow to be more perfect men and women. And the happy progression will go on till we may be able, in a sense, to return to the old days of mythology, when there was the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men. So he's now deliberately offering the meaning of the strong man as utopian. And of course, it's eugenic. He's saying that if people adopt and of course buy his universal system of physical culture, the race itself will improve. Not only will improve, but will actually perfect itself. So I don't think that Sandow was an original eugenicist, but he's adopting very cleverly, I think, the language of eugenics, which was all over the place at the time when he was performing. So now the strong man has a future. It is a future as the redeemer of an out-of-condition modernity. So that was Sandow's legacy, at least what he hoped to be his legacy. I'm now going to read the last bit before I return to Gaspar Ruiz. So, not strong enough, remember his dying words. It's hard to imagine Sandow uttering such words.
Sorry, Douglas.
What?
Sorry, we can't hear you very well. Maybe
Okay.
the microphone got disconnected.
Can you hear me now? you hear me now? Okay, I'm not muted. I don't know what to do. I'm up to 100%.
That's fine. It was just the tone, which lowered a bit, at least for me,
right.
maybe not for everybody
All
else.
right. Okay. So the last and literally backbreaking transformation of the strongman in Gaspar Ruiz is as much a demonstration as Sandow's onstage substitution of his body for a bridge. This is one of the things that he did in his shows. Gaspar's sacrifice, however, is motivated. There's a reason for it. To save his wife and child. It's motivated in the idiom of chivalry. Still, in his last act, Gaspar is still grotesque. He's still slightly comic. There he is on all fours like an animal, the cannon mouth protruding where his head should be, a hybrid creature of flesh and metal, hypophonic and ludicrous, a weird vision indeed. This performance is in any case futile. It's an impossible feat in an already doomed campaign in an already lost war. If in Sandow the strong man's body is offered as redemptive and utopian, in Gaspar Ruiz the strong body goes down to defeat, strapped to what seems like an instrument of torture, broken and disabled by a world which has no place for it. Quixotic, tragic, out of time. So the strong man's story is consigned to the past, a romantic tale, as Conrad subtitles it. But does Gaspar's strong manhood reach forward as well as back, as Sandow's aspired to do, with its promise of racial regeneration? Does Gaspar's body language too have a future tense? Well, the answer is yes. There is a strange coda to the story of Gaspar Ruiz. Old General Santiago's audience, to whom he's telling Gaspar's story, want to know what became of Gaspar's child. From his window, the old general points out a woman walking in his garden. She looked up and seeing all these eyes staring at her, she stopped, frowned, smiled, shook her finger at the general, who was laughing boisterously, and drawing the black lace on her head so as to partly conceal her haughty profile, passed out of our sight, walking with stiff dignity. This is the daughter of Herminia and Gaspar Ruiz, whom General Santiago has adopted. Her appearance is scarcely romantic. One of the English officers rather coarsely describes her as a short, stout old girl of 40 or thereabouts. She is Santiago's heiress, but, the old man joshes his visitors, I wouldn't advise any of you to ask for her hand, for if she took yours into hers, it would only be to crush your bones. She does not jest on that subject. So she may inherit Santiago's fortune, but she's already inherited her father's strength. The story of the strong man ends with the strong woman. This scene, and the garden scene that ends Gaspar Ruiz, couldn't be more dry and prosaic, with the middle-aged Herminia's old-fashioned clothes and dumpy figure, that coquettish and bossy gesture of wagging her finger at the old man, his boisterous laughter. Though Gaspar's daughter is strongly foregrounded in her unexpected appearance here at the end of the tale, the descriptive language works hard to de-romanticize her and make her ordinary. After her parents' melodramatic adventures on the wild margins of civilization, here we are back in the city and the solid domestic world of realist fiction, even briefly furnished with its favorite theme, the marriage plot. There is nonetheless something of a national allegory here, for the robust Herminia is the future of her country, inheritor of her royalist mother, her partisan father, and her Republican adoptive father, the general. The strong man is dead, and this is his legacy. His strength lives on in the body of an independent-minded, strong woman, confident under the male gaze, making her own choices. As an avatar of modernity, this is at least as convincing as the bodybuilder on his plinth. Finally, Sandow's legacy in the end was ephemeral, though he too can be seen as an allegory of modernity. He got into trouble, he fell foul of the General Medical Council, he diversified into all sorts of commercial products, training aids, clothes, and foodstuffs, all aggressively advertised. He ceased to perform. His German origins lost in popularity in 1914. He was unwisely litigious, and his overextended business empire began to fall apart. Capitalism swallowed him. He slipped into obscurity and died in 1925. The Kipling poem we saw at the beginning suggested that in the end there is a kind of kinship between strong men, whatever their provenance. And perhaps it consists in this: in the end, no strong man is strong enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. Thank you. Okay, we are perfectly on time, and we have 10 to 15 minutes for questions now. So you can either write them in the chat or just maybe raise your hand and I'll unmute you.
Andrew wants to say something.
Yes, I did hear something, but I didn't realize who was speaking.
Unmute, Andrew, unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Andrew, yes.
Oh, thank you. Yes, this is just a quick question. I'm in such fascinating papers, and I just wanted to say something about Ellen's paper, actually. This is a fascinating area, I think, the way in which Conrad paints relationships between people of two different ethnic groups, and particularly the case of Aisa and Willems, where they are Conrad's, I suppose, most detailed and certainly most extensive study of that kind of relationship. And I suppose really what I wanted to say was just whimsical, because it always strikes me that the three relationships in Conrad in the Asian fiction that I would like to know more about, and I think they might be at the same time something of a corrective to the views we naturally draw about relationships like Willems and Aisa, as you explained, Ellen, are the relationships between Stein and his Malay princess, which of course was not a long-lasting relationship. Jurgensen and the girl, who he marries later in Singapore at the hands of an industrious missionary. And indeed, Jewel and Jim, we're told more about him than those other two relationships of Jurgensen and Stein with women, but not that much, I think, in terms of understanding the sort of drivers in their relationship. So I just wondered, Ellen, if you had any thoughts about that, and whether perhaps like me, you wish that Conrad had written a few more pages on this to help us out in our interpretation of this kind of relationship.
Certainly, I mean, and those are great connections that you're drawing, and I think this is something that when I have gone back to it, it's more fascinating in some ways than I remembered, and the gaps seem to me to just point to an interesting area of study in terms of thinking more about the broader impact of that colonial situation. So I would love to kind of hear and see more, and I think there is a kind of interesting way in which Aisa is kind of temporarily pulled into a role that makes us perhaps wish we could see a little bit more of her with a little bit more insight, but we're never fully given that opportunity, and it's quite dismissive of her at some points as well.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, any more questions?
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question for Helen.
Yes, sorry, Nick.
Have you investigated much the political background of shipping arms to Barrow? Or is that a pleasure to come?
That's a pleasure to come, I think.
Yes.
I mean, it takes it does your head in after a while looking at all that digitized, all those digitized newspapers. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot more in all that, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
And a lot of unknowns at the moment about even just what happened there. And
yes.
I think if I dig long enough and hard enough in the Dutch material, as well as in the, for example, the Singapore National Library material, I shall get more out of it.
Wonderful.
because I think the people who wrote about some of the the trading stuff, like Campo, for example, they didn't have the benefit of all that digitized material. They had to actually go and physically trawl through it. And I mean, it's a perfect COVID-19 activity, is to look at digital archives.
Yes, quite, yes. Thanks, Helen. Great.
Thank you. Okay, Nick is, yes, just raising his hand.
Thank you. Sorry to ask another question. This is for Douglas. This is for Douglas, and I found your paper very interesting, Douglas. Really, I mean, really gets to the heart of a lot of Conradian issues. This question of what does a strong man mean? This is really, I think, very fundamental to Conrad, and I think it's a question which preoccupied him considerably. And I was really excited to hear your views on that. And I think perhaps for Conrad, the strong man is an ideal, yeah. So it's a useful way to understand him. But what kind of ideal is it? Because some of these strong men are physically strong, as you point out. There's the classical definition of strength, which obviously has still some prestige in 19th century culture. Also informs the romantic, shall we say, a view of strength a little bit. So, there's a kind of continuity between this idea of strength as being physical in men. But for Conrad, obviously, there's another kind of strength involved. There's a kind of moral strength, which I think was perhaps more essential to him. And in any case, I just wanted to hear your views on this, because some of his sailors are physically strong and unthinking, and some of them are more sophisticated and more morally strong, shall we say. They have strength of resistance and so on, of a moral kind rather than a physical kind.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I have actually rather deliberately avoided trying to think about the issue that you raised, because what I'm concentrating in this paper is actually the strong body. It's physical strength, and also physical masculine strength. And if you look at a set of 6, it's all about masculinity, every single tale. But particularly, this is a book that begins with Gaspar Ruiz and ends with Il Conde. And Il Conde, we first see him in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, and he doesn't like what does he call them, more robust pictures of the Roman Empire, these big sort of macho images. But what he likes is that very hermaphroditic Hermes. So of course you're right, there are much more complicated issues than simply physical ones in Conrad's oeuvre, and in a sense the question of strength is the question for Conrad. It's the question. So my paper is a bit more modest than perhaps you hoped it might be. I became fascinated. I mean, Gaspar Ruiz is the story of the strong man. And I think, am I right in saying that when it's filmed as a strong man? I think he was interested in physicality. And it did strike me, looking at the tale, the way that his presentation of physical strength seems to change throughout the narrative. As I say, when we first see this guy, he's a sort of hulking, unintellectual, boorish character. At the end, he's acquired a great dignity and become a tragic figure, but still it's an anachronistic one. I haven't yet sort of pursued this question of physical strength beyond the text that I'm looking at, but it would be interesting to do so. But I certainly agree with you that the question of moral strength is in a way the more important.
And the connection you made with the strong woman, I think, is really fundamental too, because that's exactly the point. It's just that it's not necessarily a gender specific ideal that Conrad is preoccupied with. It is, as you say, the question of strength, because we have strong women in Conrad, and who are obviously, I mean, not necessarily physically strong, but they're obviously strong. So there's a question of strength of will, perhaps strength of, I don't know, disposition, that you're absolutely right, and to connect it with the strong woman, I think.
I think in the case of the younger Armenia in Gaspar Ruiz, her physical strength translates into agency, into the ability to decide things for herself, and hence the joke about, you know, don't try and get off with this woman or she'll beat you up.
As Lena with Ricardo, for example.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, there is. Yeah.
Just a quick comment on Douglas's answer, that while you were talking, I had this distinct sense of kind of shadow paper, which was a paper about.
So you've gone.
Robert,
you're frozen out.
we can't hear you anymore, Robert. Maybe I could just take the chance of reading one.
Conde.
Yeah. Robert, sorry, we just missed your comment. Can you just, do you want to say that again?
Just very quickly, it was the sense of a kind of shadow paper while Douglas was talking, which was a paper about that other statue in Il Conde and the figure of the Count. That's all.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, yes. Okay, maybe we have time for one more quick question. Okay, there are a few questions in the chat actually, and
Anthony wants to, Anthony.
Yes,
Anthony.
there are many actually. So there are a few suggestions though, which are quite interesting. Jana Giles says that I noticed that Sandow claims to be more symmetrically muscular than the Barney's Hercules. Perhaps this is not a question so much as an observation about how the classical continues to be used as the ultimate measure to be measured against and yet also surpassed.
Yeah. Yes, that's very good. Very good point.
And also, was Hercules perhaps being regarded as something as a muscle-bound Dummkopf? If so, Heracles would not be much of a physical idea?
I don't think so. I don't think there's anything Dummkopf about the Farnese Hercules. Maybe in more modern interpretations, yes, when physical strength has become slightly comic. I don't think the classical image is of a thicker. Ajax in the Iliad, yes.
Yeah.
In Aristophanes, you've got a mockery. Can you hear me?
Yes.
In Aristophanes, you've got a mockery in the Frogs, I think it is, of Hercules as a dumb brute,
right.
and so on and so on. Just a quick thing about eugenics, because that came up. It's simply a word put together. If you take it apart, it just means happy breeding or fortunate breeding. And although it's created by people in the sciences, they'd all had some sort of classical background. So that's probably the explanation for that, rather than taking the name from young Sandow.
Oh, no, not that. But Francis Galton was very interested in Sandow, went to his performances and wrote about it. It's an interesting connection. Galton was the man who coined the phrase eugenics, I think. I see Anthony Fothergill sitting there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great. Sorry, I got muddled. Anyway, never mind. In a way, it's more a question about Sandow, because his model is the physicality of strength. Whereas if you look at the literature of classical literature, you could argue that strength lies much more in people like Odysseus or Penelope or Cassandra. Odysseus isn't thought of as being physically strong, unlike Achilles, who's a bit of a dump. I mean, this is cunning. He doesn't show as such physical strength. So I was wondering if there's a split in classical literature between physicality, which Sandow is basing his position on, and probably on the sculptures, and literature, which is as much interested in intellectual, if you like. And you could argue there's a division between physicality and rational intellectual strength.
In the Greek tradition, you could say that this is the difference between Spartan strength and Athenian strength. This is exactly the difference.
Yes. But I think that just in the case of Sandow, you have to think the genre that he was operating in was a performative, visual performative and silent one. So there wasn't much opportunity for him on stage to go into questions of intellectual strength or whatever. He was really, it was just performance and display. It was very much based on sculpture rather than on, for example, classical tragedy or philosophy.
Okay, if he'd watched any theatre, he would have had some argument to combat then on that level. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, maybe a very last question by Yael. You raised your hand. Let me unmute you.
I was just thinking about the same idea. And I thought it was significant that the question of strength had to do with the spectacle, which Douglas mentioned. And I think in literature we have, in addition to the visual, kind of the surface deep that has become so ingrained in our experience right now. We can play with levels, different levels of meaning, and I think that also goes to the difference between moral strength that was mentioned before, and kind of physical strength that particularly I think in Douglas' presentation was very, very visual, and one that was seen more than even exercised. It was a kind of a commodity, all right? And we're this is all very familiar to us today, but when you speak of moral strength, you can't see it. It's not visual. Anthony mentioned Odysseus. He's cunning. That means that he's duplicitous. He's two-faced. He has levels, and you can't see his true nature. So I think the question of visuality and strength are very important, even when we're not really testing that strength, but we're looking at it, we're appreciating it. As a commodity, as something that we can take pleasure in just by looking at it. And I would add to that, Douglas, thanks for those images. Which were
I think just to finish this, we're all a bit too literary in this Zoom. Sandow wasn't very literary. He really belongs to the kind of genres that would nowadays include things like Love Island, or superhero movies where there's almost no dialogue, but a huge amount of zapping. That's the sort of thing we're dealing with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we should finish here because we're running ahead of time and we will be muted, all of us, very soon. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you for you, to you for being here and for making this lively conversation. And I think Kim will want to tell us something before we close.
Yeah, just to say that we start again tomorrow at 2:00. So if everyone wants to come into the waiting room for about 10 to 2, then I'll let people in. We had a really good turnout today. We had about 55 people come, so that's really good. I'm also recording all of this, so we should be able to get it up on the JC website. Mary's probably crying onto her desk at the moment, the very thought of trying to do that. But anyway, but we will be back here tomorrow at 2:00. The links are on the JC website. So yeah, it's a good night from me and it's a good night from her.
Can we thank Robert and Tanya and Kim very much for organising today?
Yeah. Thank you.
And have some wine.